The story I'm interested in here is Gilgamesh. It's the oldest story that we know anything much about. Storytelling probably is much older than that because we don't know anything about the stories that were told orally and never written down. But Gilgamesh was written down. It was written down about 4,500 years ago. We don't know who wrote it. It probably comes from an oral tradition. Whether they had their own Homer of that period, we simply don't know. It comes from what we call the Babylonian Empire, which is essentially modern-day Iraq. The plot is strange and, in a way, difficult to describe. It concerns a king called Gilgamesh, but Gilgamesh has a close friend called Enkidu. And it's essentially the story of Gilgamesh and Enkidu, their adventures together, the death of Enkidu, Gilgamesh's deep despair and unhappiness at the death of Enkidu, and the travels that he goes on after the death of Enkidu in search of immortality, which he fails to find. It got translated into English about 120, 30 years ago and became a very popular story. But its popularity, to me, remains something of a mystery, and I think it contrasts very starkly and in fact very poorly with the other great literatures of the ancient world that we have, and I'm thinking here particularly of Homer and of the Bible stories. Now those stories are much later. Homer is around 800 and the Bible stories are a little bit later even than that. But in terms of interest and narrative density, I think those stories are vastly more interesting than Gilgamesh is. In order to explain why I think it's a failure as a story, at least in many ways, I need to step back a bit and say something about human psychology. And what I want to talk about is the idea of thinking and thinking about thinking. Now, human beings think, we all know that. That sounds utterly trivial. Most other animals, possibly many, even possibly all other animals, don't think. Maybe some of the apes think. Nobody's quite clear about this. So thinking is actually fairly unusual in the animal kingdom, and certainly human beings are the best at it. But human beings don't just think, they think about thinking. They have what psychologists call metacognition. They think about thinking. And it's pretty clear that no other animal does that. There's some slight implications that this is possible in some of the behavior of the higher apes, but the evidence here is extremely ambiguous and very thin. Thinking about thinking means not merely thinking what you're going to have for dinner, but who you would like to have dinner with and who would like to have dinner with you. That gives us all sorts of immense powers. It enables us to predict how other people would behave. If we know what they're thinking and we know what they want, we can sometimes predict what they will do. It also, very importantly, enables us to deceive other people because we can give them an idea about what we are thinking, which is actually wrong. We can deceive people into thinking that we want something when in fact we want the opposite of it. Almost all the fiction that we have, and certainly all the fiction that we really value and that's been really popular and has lasted, is fiction about metacognition. It's fiction about what people think about what other people think. Shakespeare is full of stories which hinge on whether somebody believes somebody else when they tell them what they think. We see it in the novels of Jane Austen, where for a whole novel she's able to sustain our interest simply by having two people who are not quite sure what they think about each other. What's remarkable about Gilgamesh from my point of view is that there's no metacognition in this story whatsoever. It never at any point depends upon knowing what somebody else thinks about what you think. Enkidu is created by the gods who want Gilgamesh to stop mistreating his subjects. Gilgamesh is a king and he's treating his subjects very badly. The gods create Enkidu as a way of distracting Gilgamesh and improving his behavior. Nothing that Enkidu does to improve Gilgamesh's behavior depends on deception. At one point they simply have a fight, and the fight ends in a sort of a draw between them. Later on, the two of them decide, for reasons that are not very clear, that they want to go off to the forest and kill the terrorizing, fierce creature that lives in the forest. Now, if this was a story from Homer, what would happen is that Gilgamesh and Enkidu would devise a plan that would deceive the monster and would enable them to defeat this physically much more powerful creature. But in Gilgamesh, that doesn't happen. All that happens is that they have a fight with the monster and they physically overcome the monster. Now, that just isn't very interesting. Physical power on its own, without a connection to thinking, metacognition, thinking about thinking, just isn't very interesting. And that's what we get time and time again in Gilgamesh. Well, it's a very interesting question about why a story that's this old is devoid of metacognition when, say, Homer at around 800 years BC is absolutely full of metacognition. So what happened between those two times? Now, some people might be tempted to say, well, maybe at the time of Gilgamesh, people didn't have metacognition. Perhaps it was a later invention. That, I think, is almost certainly not true. The Babylonians, after all, had a vast and complex empire. You can only sustain a vast and complex empire by having metacognition, by knowing what other people think, by making pacts with your enemies, by knowing when to attack them and when not to attack them. So why is it that in Gilgamesh, although metacognition presumably existed, it doesn't play a part in the story? Well, there are a couple of possibilities here, I think. One is that perhaps we just don't have the cultural background that enables us to understand the kind of ideas underneath the text. It may be, it's just possible, I suppose, that people at this time would have read into the story all sorts of things about metacognition that the story doesn't make explicit. We couldn't rule that out as a possibility, though I don't think there's very much evidence for it. The other idea, I suppose, is that while metacognition existed at this point, it just didn't have a place in the public culture. There may have been all sorts of reasons why people didn't talk about metacognition. There may have been religious or political reasons why talking about thinking, and particularly about deception, might have been not part of the public agenda. We simply don't know really the answer to that question.